Slavery at the Cape.
Slavery was a mainstay of the labor force of the Cape Colony between its foundation by the Dutch East India Company, VOC, in 1652 and abolition in 1834, by which date the Cape was under British rule. Slaves were transported to the Cape from a wide range of areas in the Indian Ocean world, including South and Southeast Asia, Madagascar and Mozambique. Some were owned by the VOC and labored on the company farms, outposts and docks. The majority were sold to settlers and worked as domestic servants in the Cape Town or as laborers on the grain, wine and pastoral farms of the Cape interior. Throughout the 18th century, slaves outnumbered settlers. Although there were a few major revolts, individual resistance was widespread and desertion common. Some runaways joined indigenous groups in the Cape interior, while others formed more isolated Moran communities. Toward the end of the 18th century, some slaves claimed individual rights, reflecting the influence of wider revolutionary movements in the Atlantic world. A revolutionary uprising took place in 1808, shortly after the abolition of the slave trade and took over the British colony. In the early 19th century, slave resentment continued to grow, especially as a boom in wine production increased labor demands. In the 1820s and the early 1830s, abolitionist voices were heard in the colony, and slavery was ended at the same time as that in the British Caribbean and Mauritius. Unlike these other British colonies, Cape slaves largely continued to work as farm laborers, and their living and working conditions produced the continued improvement of farm workers in the Western Cape region. Slaves played an important part in the creation of a distinctive creolized Cape culture, notably in the development of the Afrikaans language and the Cape musical and culinary traditions. They were also responsible for the growth of Islam in Cape Town and hinterland, which took a distinctive from influence by its Southeast Asian origins. Slavery was a key institution in the Cape Colony under its rule by the Dutch East India Company, VOC, between 1652 and 1795, and under both Dutch and British administrations between 1795 and final slave emancipation in 1834. Slaves were the mainstay of the labor force, especially in Cape Town and its rural hinterland, and for the most of the VOC period, slaves outnumbered free settlers. Slavery thus had a profound impact on the demographic, economic, and social characteristics of the early colony. Living and working conditions. Slave life was dominated by work. Quoted, "I am always working and I need to rest sometimes," unquote. Complaint from one farm slave in 1759. The Cape economy differed from that of the slave plantation societies of the American colonies. Slaves instead worked in domestic households in Cape Town and the smaller towns or villages of its hinterland, such as Stellenbosch and Swellendam, as well as the other arable grain and wine farms of the southwestern Cape. 19% of the arable farmers owned slaves, holding varied in size, but most settler farms owned fewer than 10, and holdings of more than 20 slaves were exceptional. 90 slaves carried out all the major tasks of farming, many of which were arduous and in a pre-mechanical age.